Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Laurel Ann Schrader, Director of Clinical Solutions here at TransPerfect, and I am so happy to be here. I have been with TransPerfect for 7 years, but I have over 20 years. That kind of stings to say that a little bit, Ben, but over 20 years experience in the TMF world, and I'm, again, so happy to be here. Let me pass it over to Ben for introduction as well.
Yeah, hey everyone, Ben Rogers here, Senior Manager of TMF Education with LMK, a TransPerfect company. I've been with our organization a little over 2 years now. Laurel, I'm also in the double digits. I'm at 12 years. I remember when I started, when people would say, 10 plus years, I was always amazed. And here I am at 12, and I can't believe it. I too am passionate about the TMF. It's really all I've known since I started my journey within the clinical research space. So really excited to talk to everyone today about some of the skills that are really necessary to be a TMF professional. And that's a little bit of a teaser of what Laurel and I will be talking about today as we go through the skills that we think are beneficial to have as a TMF professional. As you all are kind of listening in to the topics that we're discussing, if there's something that comes to mind for you, a particular question that you'd like us to maybe go into a little bit more detail, or a particular skill or area of interest that you want us to elaborate on, feel free to interact. You can put that into the chat, and we'll certainly work to address those topics as they come through. We do have this scheduled for about an hour, so hopefully we'll have lots of engagement, exciting topics, which kind of leads us into our initial discussion that we want to have. We're talking about what skills are necessary to be a TMF professional today, but as we were kind of developing some of the topics, we wanted to really talk about the evolution of a TMF professional. And with that 12 and 20 plus years experience, I think we've kind of seen the evolution of TMF professionals and what we knew. I know we were talking about both being document reviewers. So Laurel, did you maybe want to talk about some of those skills of the past that people really associated with a TMF professional?
Absolutely. I mean, I know when I got started, I was very green, didn't know anything about it. And I was literally put into a room with four walls and no window. And I was given a red pen and a stamp. And I was told to stamp the documents, do all of that. So you had to be detail oriented. So, back then, even some of the skills we have now, you had to be detail oriented. You had to be focused on what was there. You had to have some sort of organizational skill, right? We know that that's huge. And as this has gone forward, we all talk about paper, and everyone's like, oh, paper's gone. Paper's not gone. We still have clients that still have paper. But there's this big evolution. There's this push to get everything electronic, and some of these skills still relate, right? The organizational skills, detail oriented. You need to know your regulations, right? I wish I had it here to pull up on the screen, but I still have the ICH guideline. That's the little binder.
Yeah.
And I have posted notes through it. I have every year since I started, so that's kind of scary. But you have to know your regulations. You have to know all of that. And we talked just briefly about the university and understanding all of those aspects. You learn something new every day. Like, something changes every day. It's not the same thing. So it's really, really hard, or really, really important to know all of that and focus on those key things for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I fully agree. When I started, I was also in paper. Luckily, I did have a window in our office, so I had a little bit of a
lucky you.
I know. But kind of same thing. It really started with, your attention to detail, quality oriented organization. Those were a lot of the buzzwords. The career path within the TMF space was often, document reviewer, maybe manager of TMF, or you were more of a line manager. But I know when I started, TMF was looked at as kind of the foot in the door into clinical research, where you then go to maybe supporting clinical operations, project management, CRA. So you are really just, learning the ropes of clinical research as that TMF associate or document reviewer. And as you mentioned, attention to detail was the primary focus. We saw that in almost every job description for, document reviewer or TMF associate. And we really didn't see that career ladder. And I think that really ties into maybe the passive approach that a lot of organizations have tended to have when it comes to
Right.
the TMF. It's a repository, it's a file room. We don't really look at the TMF, or didn't maybe 10 to 15 years ago, look at the TMF as like an active management tool for clinical research processes. So I think as we've seen the evolution to electronic documentation and that easier
Mhm.
access where we can actually get information and make decisions based off the facts in the TMF, we've kind of seen this push to how can TMF support our project teams more, and
Right.
who should have ownership of TMF activities and what's really required. So I think that brings us to the TMF professionals of today and what we're hoping to continue to evolve to. So I know you and I are going to discuss some of the skills that we didn't get to in our previous series that we shared with everybody. Hopefully you saw the 5 skills that we had both shared, and we have some additional attributes that we want to talk about today, and we may revisit some of our favorites from previous. But Laurel, can I turn it over to you to maybe talk about some of the attributes that you think are beneficial to have as a TMF professional in today's TMF world?
Sure, sure. So, we talked, the very first blog was attention to detail, quality, all of that stuff, knowing the regulations. Then Ben, you went through a set of 5 as well, and again, me being old school, I have paper in front of me with my notes because that's just me. But there's some things that we need to think about now. There's still project management, even
Mhm.
whether you have a project manager or whether you're handling it yourself. You have to have a level of understanding of what all of that is, right? So you need to, as that TMF champion, as that master, whatever you call it, you have to understand that there is that level. You have to know when things are coming in. What are the timelines? What are your milestones and events? That's project management, understanding when those certain documents are due. Another huge one, IT, right? We all went from paper and now everything's electronic. Knowing your system inside and out, being the advocate for that system, being your TMF admin, and knowing the ins and outs of how certain systems can help you. Where do certain systems hinder you, and where do you need to build certain things? But also understanding what those systems can give you. How
Yep.
many people do we know, Ben, that talk about trackers, and we have this Excel spreadsheet that does this, this, and this, and we pull all this stuff. When you and I both know there's a little button inside most, if not all, systems that can pull that report out for them, right? So
Right.
you need to understand that and be able to identify those, or take those reports and identify trends. Back in the day, we had spreadsheets of how many documents were missing from CRAs, how many site documents were missing, how many things were spelled wrong, like just really long lists. Well, now you can take those reports and you can filter by issues because you enter that information in. You can filter by issues. You can set yourself up to be inspection ready from the start. If anybody's ever heard me on a webinar, that's my favorite saying. So knowing that your system can give you those tools and being able to relate to that. Is it easy? Is everybody gonna be able to jump right in and know the system? No. You're gonna have to learn it, understand it, just like we all had to back in the day with our paper and our stamps and our pencils and markers, you know?
Right. Absolutely. And I think something that really ties into that theme of project management, IT, are those leadership skills that we actually need to have in TMF management. And I think, again, a lot of people really look at TMF management as a more passive career or a
Mhm.
passive department. Everyone tells us what we should be doing, or they provide us with the documentation and then we take action. But we have to be leaders within the TMF space and really lean into those project management skills, but also leadership skills, things like motivation and engagement. As you mentioned, we have timelines and deadlines that we need to establish, but we also have to enforce those expectations as a leader. So it's not only communicating those expectations, but it's continuing to engage and remind, motivate team members. We know, I always say I'm not naive to the fact that TMF is not most people's favorite activity when it comes to clinical research. I absolutely get it. It's the
Very
paperwork,
true.
right? It's the
Yeah.
administration. side of things, but we have to continuously engage with those stakeholders to remind them of the expectations. From the technology perspective, we have to engage with them and be transparent about, what our system does really well, but also maybe some of the areas that they might be a little bit frustrated with. We have many different platforms that we absolutely love, but we can always recommend one or two things that we would love to change about them, right? Even though it's our
Right.
favorite, if it could only do this much more, I think as a TMF professional, you need to be transparent in your leadership skills and be honest. Nobody wants to be told it's always going to be perfect, or we do want to be told it's going to be perfect, but we know that something might go wrong along the way. So we need to be able to react to that and also kind of set that expectation. I think that, when there's bumps in the road, come to me. That's the leader, right? I'm going to
Yeah.
help you to overcome this problem. And so something that I'm always talking about as a TMF professional is really being that source of knowledge. If somebody is unsure of how to perform a task in the system, or if they're unsure about the process, it's our job to really remind them or set those expectations of how it's done or what should be done by who along the way. So we are leaders within the TMS space developing those skills. We're not just waiting for someone to tell us what to do. We are equally reaching out to project team members, file this document, close this issue. I know we're kind of that buzz in the ear that a lot of people don't like, but it is very important for us to have those skills and be comfortable, right? In
Yes.
those confrontational settings, it gets very heated very quickly sometimes, where people are unhappy that they have to respond to a query or that they have to submit documents or perform TMFQC. But it's our job to remind them of the expectations that have been established, from that project management side. This is what we have to do. Here's how you're going to do it, how I'm going to support you. That's kind of that buzzword for me, is support and collaborate. I know those are both very popular, but it absolutely has to be that way as a TMF professional. So that's what really sticks out to me. I know there's others that we'll kind of get to as well. So I'll kind of hand it back over to you. Any things you want to talk about, go back over?
Yeah, so something just to add, because I think you said it, and it's so important. You have to have a culture and build
Mm,
that culture in your team. So if you're the TMF champion or the TMF admin, and it's your job to make sure that the TMF is complete at all times, you have to make sure that you hold those other functional areas accountable. Do they understand what the requirements are for a TMF? Because I can tell you, there's two departments that come to my head, I won't call them out right now, that just will not submit their documents to the TMF. They
sure.
just they'll stack them up on their desk, or they'll stack them up in a file on their desktop. They will wait to the end of the study, and right off the bat, right, you no longer have a contemporaneous TMF. So
Yeah.
if you're not supplying that, if you don't build that culture right away, set those expectations, ensure that they understand why the TMF is so important.
Mhm.
Going back to the olden days, as I like to call them, um, we didn't have that. It was literally three people that sat in this room and organized the TMF, and we would go to people's desks, take the paper off their desks, scan them in the system, and we had an MS Access database was our TMF.
Mhm.
So setting that expectation, as I've evolved through this role, again, I let people tell me that that's the way it was supposed to be done, and you
Mhm.
start to think about how inefficient that is,
Yep.
how unorganized that is, and so taking the time to set those meetings up, be that champion right at the beginning, ensure that you have upper management support
Yep.
on that, because again, at the end of the day, if you're a sponsor, we'll just pick on sponsors. If you're a sponsor and you have one person literally just doing this,
Mhm.
it's the upper management that's actually responsible for it, right? Because that
Right.
ownership, the whole company. So knowing that and ensuring that, and knowing the risks. If you don't
Mhm.
set that, knowing the risks of what you're going to put yourself into, um, being inspection ready, using all of these skills, looking at any tools that companies have for inspection readiness is so important, because you want to set yourself up for success.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that. I think you definitely picked out the culture part. I don't think I specifically mentioned, but that's so critical.
Yeah.
And, people often ask the question, well, how do you change culture, right? And it is very difficult because it's up to each individual within your organization whether or not you're going to adapt to these perceived changes within your organization. But it's always going to start, as you mentioned, with leadership, that buy
Hmm.
in to the process. And then it ties into what does your process actually say?
Right.
So I encourage people, part of that leadership project management is know how your process holds individuals accountable. Does it say the TMF team is going to do everything? Or does it say document owners, functional areas, subject matter experts also have that involvement? So that's kind of a key tip I would say is,
Hmm.
look at your process. What does it require of your organization? That's what's really going to drive that culture. Now, easier said than done. When people have
Absolutely.
this perception that they're now taking on more work, that's often a little bit more difficult, which kind of ties into a topic I think we had talked about previously is, communication as a TMF professional. Kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier with that transparency.
Hmm.
People perceive work in the trial master file. When I say people, functional areas outside of the
Yep.
TMF department oftentimes perceive TMF related work as additional responsibilities, not part of their core role. So that's why that culture and that process is so important. It needs to be in job descriptions. Submit responsible for QC of the TMF, responsible for document quality in the trial master file. So that is set at the very beginning and then reinforced through training and expectations. But also communication is so important when we're reaching out to project team members. I always say we can only leverage what processes are available. So if our process doesn't support me asking a project manager to perform an activity or a CRA to perform an activity, they're going to perceive that as, oh, you just want me to do it because you don't have time. But what does your
Right.
process say? So I always say effective communication starts with, citing your process of why you're asking someone to do something that really holds them accountable.
Hmm.
And I think, again, it comes back to that kind of passive approach we've had for so long is that people perceive TMF management as the responder. Like, I'm going to tell you what to do. I need you to do for me. But it's both ways, right? I have my area of expertise as a TMF professional, which I will address, and I expect you as a functional area to address your area of expertise. And then we have to meet in the middle, and that's
Yeah.
where the communication comes into play. You can't be scared of sticking up for yourself, sticking up for your department, reminding people of what those expectations are, holding people accountable. I remember the first couple of times I pushed back to a project manager. You view project teams as a hierarchy a lot of times, and the PM is, the person that you don't want to upset. I'm not trying to upset you. I just want to make sure we're holding each other accountable. We're collaborating together. It's really equal. We all have to work towards that same goal of inspection readiness. So there is no hierarchy. We shouldn't be scared to reach out or to tell someone we need them to do something because
Hmm.
that's the expectation. So communication for me is really big. Feeling confident in yourself, knowing what your processes are, that's really going to help you as a TMF
Yeah.
professional, and being a little bit more proactive in our approach.
I agree. I mean, going back to what you said about the functional areas too, and this might end up just being a functional area discussion because we find that that's where a lot of that is.
Yeah.
We find the issues, but like I said, setting yourself up, setting those expectations up front,
Mhm.
knowing, and you said it, create the process. This is your life cycle. This is your project life cycle. This is the steps that you need to take to ensure that. There's such a negative thing from back in the day, right? I can remember going to certain functional areas and saying, I don't have your documents.
Mhm.
Well, I have them. Okay. Well, that doesn't help me. I need them in the TMF, right?
Mhm.
Um, because at the end of the day, an inspector comes in. What is the saying we always say? If it's not written, it didn't happen, right?
Yep.
We used to joke and say, if it's not filed, you didn't do it,
Yep.
because we we need that. If inspector comes
Mhm.
in and all of your documentation shows that you literally uploaded it a week before or the day that you received notification of an inspection,
Mhm.
that's so bad. And setting those expectations, having the conversation with the teams, explaining, like I said earlier, explaining the importance of the TMF. I
Mhm.
can't tell you how many webinars and workshops we've done this year specifically for that topic
Mhm.
to clients.
Yeah.
And it goes both ways, guys. It's not just sponsors, it's CROs. You have to know what your TMF looks like. Does your sponsor have access? And if you're that TMF champion of a sponsor, know what your CRO is doing. If
Yep.
you're the CRO TMF champion, share your knowledge with the sponsor. Don't leave the sponsor out to dry. And like I said, it goes both ways.
Right.
At the end of the day, the TMF has to be complete and it should be inspection ready. And if you set that with your functional areas, your other vendors, right? You're communicating, you're being detailed, you're showing organizational skills, you're showing project management skills, you're across the board covering all of those top skills.
Absolutely. I think one thing that kind of sticks out to me, we kind of touched on this recurring theme of, setting expectations, establishing expectations, but we know expectations change all the time, day to day. So I think it's also important for us to remember like flexibility and adaptability to when milestones on a project change. How does that impact the trial master file? If timelines are extended, how is that going to impact expectations as well? So I always remind everyone, we can't necessarily live in this binary of like yes or no. Clinical research just isn't really, it's so funny. We want it to be very much like, this is the process. It's going to happen exactly like this, but it doesn't, right?
It does not.
So we really have to understand as TMF professionals, how do we react to certain situations? How is that going to impact resourcing, timelines, reporting, metrics, all of that. And we have to be accommodating to project teams and allow for those exceptions to be made at times.
Absolutely.
We can't be so rigid that, the SOP may say all issues need to be resolved within X amount of days. If someone isn't able to resolve an issue, it's not that we then become this, drill sergeant that's like, this isn't resolved. You guys are not meeting these expectations. It's understanding why, right? Maybe there's this outlying cause that somebody's out of the office, so we can't resolve that issue. So we need to have that grace as well. That's maybe another way to say adaptability and flexibility. It kind of goes back to that theme of collaboration and teamwork, that we hold each other accountable, but in a respectful way. And we also do allow for those outliers to not, derail everything. I think we also have to understand that we may set expectations. We should communicate timelines, right? Let's say there is an upcoming audit or inspection that we're notified about. We know submissions might be coming in, so we have to be able to set what those expectations are, that you all need to get your submissions in by X amount of days so that we have time to process that documentation. But something comes up, there's another deliverable that's impacting, so we need to be able to think through situations and allow for changes to those expectations to occur. Otherwise, we're not going to have a positive relationship with our sponsors, our CROs, our project team members, because now we're going to be looked as that kind of authoritative individual that says it's either this way or no way at all. And you're really going to lose that engagement. I have found that if you have someone who's viewed as combative, people don't want to interact. They don't want to ask questions because they feel like it's always going to be a no. So I do think we have to remember flexibility is needed, despite maybe it feeling like it's not something that's part of the clinical research process. It very much is.
It absolutely is. I mean, if you look at protocols, right?
Oh, yeah.
Everybody starts their study and says, we're only going to have one protocol. I don't think I've ever been part of one study where there's been one protocol. It's 100 amendments, more versions of the protocol. So you absolutely, and that's a skill in itself, right? Of knowing that you might have one protocol now.
Yep.
And when you have that second protocol, you need to communicate that to the team. You need to communicate that to whoever's maybe managing your TMF, right?
Yep.
So making sure events are created and then all applicable documentation is in place. I can say from personal experience that I worked on a global clinical trial, and we had a recruitment plan, a global recruitment plan.
Interesting.
That was all we were going to do, was a global recruitment plan.
Yeah. Okay.
And I was still fairly green, so I wasn't. I just, okay, cool, one document.
Yeah.
Within 2 hours, I now had a global plan, and then I had local IRB plan.
Yeah.
And then within a couple more hours, I had global plan, local IRB plan, and country plan, because one country couldn't follow the rest, right?
Yeah.
So I had to adapt. I had to make sure that all of those requirements were created. What was that what was that recruitment plan going to do for that country's approval letter, and how many more documents we're going to have for that event. So you have to be flexible. There's
Yep.
no, as setting expectations doesn't mean you're not flexible. It just means
Sure.
we're going to set that initial set of expectations, right? And we're going to give that caveat that it's going to change, and we will communicate that. Because if you don't communicate it, at the end of the day, your TMF is a mess,
Right.
because you're missing things or you filed too many things. So you have to be open and willing to do that as well.
Absolutely. And I think that kind of ties into a broader point around, if these things don't happen, or as to your point of if we have different versions of the recruitment plan and we don't kind of understand the larger impact of those expected documents and update those reports, risk management is really big within kind of the TMF professional space as well. We need to be forward thinking at all times. I think when a lot of people look at the trial master file, we always hear that like snapshot of now, especially with reports and metrics. It's really looked at the status as of right now. We have to think historical context, forward thinking as a TMF professional to identify what those trends are. So what risk are we at if we've noticed a decrease in submissions month to month over the past 6 months? Why? Is it because the study slowed down? We're not seeing as much recruitment or study activity, or is it because people are just no longer submitting documents? What's really the root cause there? I think it's also important to recognize the risk associated with the TMF in general. It is that story, as we mentioned, if it's not written down, it's not available in the TMF. It's like we never did the activity. And as you mentioned, people always say, oh, I have it in my in my drive, or I have it printed at my desk. That's no good. An auditor inspector, they want it right there. So we have to be proactive as TMF professionals in communicating that risk, right? Like if it's not filed at this time, the risk is you will be responding to an audit finding, not me, because it's TMF doesn't mean I'm responding to that. Yep. We also need to be proactive in trends, as you've talked about, like IT skills are so important. That kind of ties into metrics and reporting a little bit. When you look at that information, that data analysis, what is it telling you? Are you concerned by that information? Who do you need to be reaching out to? I often see an approach with metrics that we just kind of send them out to the project team a lot of times, but we're not communicating anything that is of concern to us. We're really thinking that the project team is going to do that for us, or do that for themselves rather. But do people actually open that report, right, and look at the information? So we need to be communicating what we are perceiving as a risk, areas of concern as well. Again, it's really tying into that theme of us being more proactive and having ownership of TMF activities versus just kind of dispersing all of this information and allowing people to, we always say, we'll send out the queries, they'll resolve them. We'll send out metrics, they'll interpret them. Maybe not. They may never open the report. So we need to assign actions. We need to be clear in our communication to really say we are at risk for audit or inspection findings, or we're at risk for not having the TMF be complete or not meeting a timeline that we've established because you're not closing out your quality issues fast enough. So, we only have 5 more days to do it. So I think risk management is another big one, and being able to identify what those risks are and communicating that to our project teams or our CROs or our sponsors, depending on the relationship.
Yeah. And you said a few things there too. You said, we're at risk for this. We're at risk for this.
Mm-hmm.
You might be the TMF champion. You might have all of these skills, but at the end of the day, going back to the culture thing too, you're a team. Mm-hmm. Everyone is a team. If your drug doesn't get approved, guess what? It's for everybody, right? So having that conversation of we're a team, we're in this together. What do you need? If there's a functional area that has all their stuff saved, or there, like you said earlier about a conflict or some other task that needs to be done, what can you or people that work with you do to assist that group to get their information in? You're being collaborative, right? You're ensuring that everybody's working together. I always tease and say, well, they didn't get it in, it's on them.
Yeah.
But you can't do that, right?
Right.
We tease and say that, but at the end of the day, I'm always the first person to be like, all right, give it to me, I'll take care of it. But you set, like we talked about those expectations and being flexible. That's where you're flexible. You're asking and you're helping. There is always a risk with a TMF. There is no perfect TMF, and I would challenge anybody to show me a perfect TMF.
Right.
But knowing those risks ahead of time, you're going to set yourself up to mitigate those for sure.
Yeah.
Filings of documents, things like that.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting to me as we kind of talk through this, because I do think back to, again, when I started as a document reviewer. I think I was considered was it a document specialist at the time? It was what I was considered, reviewing paper documents. The focus was just, quality
Mhm.
of the documents that were being received. There was no larger thought on really like metrics, reporting, the health of the TMF.
Yeah.
It was really just kind of we file this documentation, we provide the information to the project team, when they would come down to the file room to do their reviews. And so, I hope that people are seeing this pretty dramatic shift in expectations. And I think that has helped us as well, just as an industry, in seeing this shift in having careers specifically within the TMF beyond filing documentation or reviewing documentation. It's something
Hmm.
I'm so passionate about because, as you mentioned, there's really no such thing as a perfect trial master file, despite if we have everything, in
Yep.
our SOPs that helps us to achieve that. Mistakes are going to happen. A document's going to get lost. Somebody's not going to sign something when they were supposed to sign it. And so we really need to make sure as professionals, we're working with our sponsors, our CROs, our project team members to identify what those risks are, or what those gaps or issues
Hmm.
were, and working to resolve those. So we're now more a day-to-day involved with the management of the study, the management of the trial master
Hmm.
file. And so I'm so appreciative of that as well, because I think why I've stayed in the trial master file is, and now specifically in the training space, is I just love trying to challenge people's understanding and perception of what the TMF is, and helping them to understand their role as well. And I think that's something that a TMF professional should have, those skills to be able to help people understand what their role, so what our functional areas roles are when it comes to the trial master file. So we know what we're responsible for, but do you know what you're responsible for? So I've just been so appreciative of that kind of shift in mentality as well. Kind of to circle back to that point, I hope that people listening in are seeing that value in career. I sound like a recruiter right now for the TMF space, but I kind of want to be, right. Like, I want more people in the TMF. I want people often see, they're like, I want to be a CRA. I want to travel and see the world. But I want people to say, like, I want to be in the TMF. I want to be the problem solver. That's another
Yeah.
skill, right? I want to be the person identifying these issues and communicating these issues to project teams, because the TMF is so important during audits and inspections. It's what's looked at. It's the book. That's what I often say.
Yeah.
It has to speak for itself. We shouldn't be expected to ask or answer questions. It should really provide all of that information. So that's my role, right? To make sure the
Yeah.
team writes that story together. All of our authors are doing a good job. So that's just something I kind of wanted to briefly mention. It's been a couple minutes there, but I can't express it enough, how passionate I am about that TMF champion or professional
Yeah.
role, and how it's evolved over time.
Well, and it's funny too. You said a couple things there that I giggled at. So, um, you said it's the book. I say it's the story in all the
Yeah.
chapters.
Yeah.
But going back to what you said about ETMF Health, I didn't even hear about ETMF Health until the
Mhm.
very first demo I watched for an ETMF, because
Right.
they didn't say that. You
Mhm.
filled out your spreadsheet and you provided that. I think I think the thing we one of the things we didn't touch on too much, but I think it's imperative to mention, is time management.
Sure.
Know your timelines.
Mhm.
What are you telling your team how long they have? Like, if you're a sponsor, how soon does CRO need to provide those documents? How often are you doing your quality reviews? Knowing how often your periodic reviews. Do you have a process for that?
Yep.
You want to follow your own guidance. So you want to, if you have 10 to 12 days for documents to be uploaded, okay, follow that.
Yep.
Um, escalate that if that's not the case.
Right.
But overall, knowing how long it takes you to process documents, how often are you doing those periodic reviews? What are the global standards? What are the industry standards? And how does your company relate to that? Knowing all of those things, right? So we talked the first five, right? The first five we did was attention to detail, organizational skills, knowledge of requirements, regulatory requirements, communication skills, and time management. We've touched on all of those now today.
Yep.
Those are key just for basic knowledge or basic job function for somebody doing TMF, right? And then Ben, you talked about quality control, technology, data management. I can't remember the other two that you talked about. I think I flipped my paper too fast.
I think the adaptability, the collaboration.
Adaptability and collaboration. Yes.
Yeah.
So right there's the 10, that the first top 10 that we talked about.
Yep.
And then we talked again today, we kind of stressed IT skills. We talked about leadership skills, risk management, and then we talked about project management. One thing we really didn't talk about, I'm going to throw it back to you, is analytical skills.
Yeah. So I think when I think about like analytical skills, it does tie into being able to kind of read between the lines a lot of times. So when you look at a metrics report, for example, if we're talking about like data analysis here, it's really looking at the report and understanding what is it telling me. We've seen TMF technology really grow in recent years, especially metrics and reporting are often a very big buzzword in any type of sales meeting or implementation plan, but understanding where the information is coming from in your metrics and how that particular report or that metric is produced is so important. Understanding, what you need to look at and gather more information. So for example, if you got a report, a completeness report that tells you the TMF is, 85% complete, and maybe that's within your threshold at your organization, you really need to understand though, it's 85% complete, but where, who is somebody 100%? So for me, the data analysis also ties into communication and oversight in enforcing expectations. So if you look at a report and it's 85% complete, and you look at monitoring and they're 100% complete, you may want to reach out to them to say, great job, right? Like reinforcing you are doing a good job here. We always tend to focus on the negative. I also say you have to applaud and praise people. But then you maybe need to drill a little bit further. There's a functional area. We won't call out any functional area here, but maybe there's just a functional area who's not hitting the mark. And you need to reach out to them, right? To understand why perhaps they're not reaching the mark. So I think sometimes people just look at the metric as a whole and say, they send it out to the team and say, we're 85% complete. Some people have actions to submit documents and some do not. You need to be communicating specifically there. You also need to understand sometimes reports are generated incorrectly, right? We click the wrong button. We don't apply a filter. Does it make sense? If you are running a report that says the TMF is like 3% complete, don't freak out. Maybe right away. Maybe you didn't run the report correctly. You forgot to filter for certain milestones and events. And when you regenerate it, you're like 96% complete. Okay, a much better result. Sometimes you regenerate it and you are 3% complete and you freak out a little bit. But I think that's so important to really understand, and for you to be able to understand what you are looking at, be able to interpret that information and then communicate that. I've seen so many raw data sets sent out to project team members. When they open up an Excel table that's 300 columns of information or a bunch of quality issues, they probably aren't going to review that in entirety or for that granular level of detail. So we need to be able to understand what that information is and how we can report that outward so that action is taken. So that really sticks out for me. I'm guilty of it. I've generated reports and kind of let me go back and redo it. So it definitely is important because it can cause the consequence there is it causes alarms, right? If you send out a report to a sponsor that's incorrect, then the alarm bells are raised. We're taking actions, and then you could be like, oh, it was a mistake. Why, right? Like, why did you make this mistake? You never want to be in that situation. So you really just need to take a step back, look at the information, do a logic check. That's really important for me.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's so important. I think I've done the same thing. Like literally this week, I pulled a report and was like, wow, that seems off. But I sent it to the PM anyways, and then instantly was like, didn't filter it right. You're wrong, but it happens. And listen, no one's perfect. Right. It's gonna happen. Technology is not perfect. It's gonna happen. Just pat yourself on the back, knowing that you're doing the best you can, and But I think at the end of the day, the TMF champion, it can be anybody, right? It can be someone like us that started in the weeds and is now where we are in our careers. It can be somebody that literally started 2 or 3 years ago and just has all of these skills and is just blowing the roof off, right? And it could be somebody that's just in the middle that just has worked their way up and has enjoyed learned the different skills all the way up the ladder. But it's imperative that those are the skills that you look for when you're looking for an employee, or you're looking for somebody to, whether it be a study owner, whether it be a project manager, that a CTA, whatever it is, you want to make
Yeah.
sure that you've got those skills, because it's only going to move you forward through success.
Absolutely. And one thing I do like to remind people is, we've talked a lot about like knowing the expectations, knowing what the regulation requires. And I think another skill that we hadn't really talked about in the previous series, and honestly, I don't think we had it in our original list here, is just kind of being comfortable in saying that you don't know the answer or knowing
Yeah.
where to go to get that information. I remember when I was shadowing, as a senior TMS specialist and trying to move to that managerial role. And I was shadowing a current manager, and they were being asked questions during audits or during kickoff meetings with the sponsor, and just knew it, right away. And I was like, there's no way. Like, I don't know the answer. There's no way I'm ever going to
Yeah.
be able to
Yeah.
do that. When file room tours were going on and people were providing responses, I was just like, there's no way my brain can retain all of this information. And you will get there. But there
Yeah.
are going to be times where just a random question is asked that you have never heard of. You're like, I didn't even think that was a question. Like, I've been
Yep.
asked, like, how thick are the walls within your file room? How much space is above the ceiling to the actual roof line? Because we were on the top
Yep.
floor. And that's just like, I've never been asked that question. So I was like,
Yep.
you have to be comfortable saying, I will get that information for you, and knowing where to go. So is it in your process? Who are your contacts, right? That communication and relationship
Yep.
building is so important. So when you need a favor from IT or QA or whoever it may be, they're more willing to help you. But I do think there's something about recognizing the things that you don't know. And when you are stumped,
Yeah.
who can you go to? Where can you go to? That's so important as well. I teach all the time regulatory requirements. I admit to everyone, I can't cite every a regulatory guidance document word for word. Sometimes I have to go confirm that information, but I know where to go to get that information when I'm asked, or where to
Yep.
guide you if you ask that particular question. So I don't want people listening in thinking, oh my gosh, I have to know and retain all of this information. You need to know some of the basics,
Yeah.
absolutely. But when you get to those more like granular level detail of questions, just know where to go to actually access that information. And Ty, sorry, I get so wordy. I'm just so passionate. You need to make sure you're communicating the correct information. So, not
Yes.
going off of assumptions. Like, I
Right.
think it's 30 days, and then you have to go back and say, actually, it's 15. Now, what that person thought they had is no longer the case. So,
Right.
being comfortable, again, not answering a question, because we have this perception that if I don't answer the question right away, they think I have like a lack of knowledge, or they don't have trust in me. They're going to be more upset if you have to kind of go back and say, actually, I was wrong.
Yep.
Here's the right information.
Yeah.
Glad you got it to them, but just be comfortable saying, I'll get that to you. So sorry to go
Oh,
on a long
that's
winded tangent there.
that's that's so imperative. I mean,
Mhm.
and I can speak for myself that literally the other day, on a client call, they asked me a question and I knew the answer, but in my head I was like, is that right? So I just said, you know what? Let me just confirm that. I'll get right back to you. And I
Yep.
literally within 10 minutes got them the
Mhm.
answer. But you have to have that confidence, and have the
Yep.
confidence in yourself that those things are going to happen. Those questions are going to come up.
Yep.
It's just the way it is.
Yeah.
And don't doubt yourself. um I mean, I think we all doubt ourselves a little bit, right? Like, I
Sure.
knew the answer and I could have said yes, that's right, but I knew that if I had to backtrack, I would have felt horrible.
Sure.
So it made more sense to do it that way, so I agree.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, be confident in yourself, but it's okay. We don't know everything. I'm sure people are probably going to ask us questions. This kind of ties into our next topic here. I know we only have about 15 minutes or so left, and we did want to make sure if there's questions that were asked, we were able to address those. And who knows, we both hosted webinars before where a question comes up, you're like, oh, that's a really good one
Let me
on
get
the
back to
fly.
you.
Yeah, let me get back to you. And while maybe we're getting some of those questions come in, one thing I'll say, we've touched on the time management piece as well. I think there's another element of clinical research, that there's this expectation for instantaneous responses a lot of times, because it's all about regulatory is like at all times in a timely manner. Don't rush yourself.
Mhm.
Make sure again, you're not just doing a quick Google search for an answer, because what you Google may not actually be the current regulation, right? As you
Right.
mentioned, it changes. We currently have some draft guidance for ICH-GCP out there. It's not currently effective. It's in its draft state. So you want to make sure you have the current guidance available. So take your time in getting that
Yeah.
information. Don't panic. I think that's another thing is oftentimes we have this initial just like, oh my gosh, I have to do this right now. You've got a little bit of time. You don't have 6
Yeah.
months. You need to address it in a timely manner, but it doesn't have to be 30 seconds.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So I think some questions may have been published already. I'm just seeing if anything, and I'll check to see if there's anything. I didn't see it in the chat, but we'll see if a question comes through. There's our banner, seeing if anything specific comes through. And these are for those listening live. I think you should be able to populate that. Anything related to the skills, any questions about how do you develop those skills, and maybe if nothing's coming in, Laurel, that's maybe a topic we can touch on is how can we develop those skills within our organization? And that may be something we'll see if something comes up in the next little bit. But I think when I think through skill development, we need to think beyond like LMS trainings that we're listening to, or beyond just like, oh, here's some YouTube videos on how, effective time management practices. We really need to work into like real world application and allow
Absolutely.
individuals to kind of participate or share those examples. And I know it's tough because you're like, well, we don't want to assign somebody responsibilities that they're not yet ready for. But learning about time management, or I see questions come in, so
Yeah.
I'll address that one. But learning about something and then actually doing it are entirely different. So you have to give opportunities to, do a sample like metrics reporting. I want you to generate this metric. You're just going to provide it back to me as your line manager. I want you to present this information as you would to a client, right? Provide those types of opportunities, not just saying this is how you generate metrics. So
Absolutely. Absolutely.
yeah. Okay. So this is a really fantastic question of, looking at the current TMF scenario or landscape, what are some of the possible careers we can have? And so I think for me, I think there is a need for document reviewers, right? That is a need for a quality expectation. So there are people who truly just enjoy reviewing documentation. That's absolutely a core foundation to TMF management. But we see different kind of roles that are available. So Laura, let me let you speak to more of the technical side, like the IT if you want to, and I can take more of like the oversight. Would that work?
Yeah. So, I mean, when you're looking at the system and you're thinking about careers, let's talk about the electronic. You definitely need that person that can review the document,
Mhm.
that understands the documents, that can do the metadata. So you're kind of what we would call maybe a document specialist.
Yep.
That they would do something like that. Some areas will call that person a CTA.
Yeah.
So depending on the client, it could be a CTA, and then it goes up from there. You might have somebody could go with a path of an auditor, where
Mhm.
you're doing periodic quality reviews. Somebody could go the path of just quality reviews, where they're doing periodic reviews. And then another thing kind of right in the middle is a TMF study owner. You're that person that is managing that overall TMF, and then you just build from there up to leadership. But on a technical side, specifically for the document specialist, um, CTA. Sometimes you'll see a CTM, which is
Mhm.
a little bit different. You'll see that
Yep.
clinical trial manager be that TMF person. It just
Yep.
really depends on the company itself and what their structure is with job titles.
Sure.
But again, I started as a document clerk. They don't even have that job title anymore for what we
Sure.
would do. But um, I went from document clerk to document specialist, or
Mhm.
document associate to document specialist to a startup specialist.
Okay.
So you can also bridge out startup maintenance. There are different roles within areas or companies that break out that functionality. So my last sponsor, I was a startup specialist. That's what I did. I handled every single reg packet that came in, and
Yep.
I managed all of that. And then at the end of it, I took on the overall consultant admin aspect of it too. So
Nice. Yeah, and I mean, I think I agree that it really is going to depend on the organization. And one thing that I think organizations need to recognize in career ladders is it's not just associate document specialist, senior document specialist, principal document
Hmm.
specialist. That's a ladder, yes, but what are the new skills
Yeah.
that you are learning, right? Like you need to understand, like, are you just a document reviewer? And now we're going to add on metrics and reporting, right? Now you're going to be
Hmm.
communicating outwardly to sponsors or to project team members. We're seeing like TMF leads or TMF study owners, as you mentioned, that have a bit more responsibility
Yep.
for ensuring timelines are met for QC. They're responsible for making sure quality issues are resolved. We see admin roles, especially whether that's maybe with a vendor. So we have vendors that offer eTMF platforms. Maybe they're study owners in the TMF space. Maybe we have CRO or sponsor team members that are system
Hmm.
admins. Maybe you have an in-house system as well that you manage. But there are more technical roles like that are available where you're putting in milestones or events, or you're working in the system to configure the sites, the contacts. So there are kind of different routes that you can take. Obviously, it's going to be dependent on an organization. For someone who
Hmm.
does have a fixation on technology and system admin, you may want to look for an organization that offers those opportunities. But each of these, they are out there. They exist kind of in the current landscape. So from the very basic of reviewing documentation, then kind of evolving those skills to TMF reviews, to TMF oversight through our project management, TMF oversight and TMF management through metrics and reporting. Line manager responsibilities, those are also going to be in the space. Having all of these skills and knowing what's expected of a TMF professional does help you to be a better line manager. And, there are directors, there are VPs into that
Hmm.
senior and executive leadership. It does exist. So there is a pathway, just depending on what you really find interesting. So it's a really great question, because I think when
Yep.
I started, 12 years ago, truly, several of the organizations, it was document reviewer, manager, and then essentially like director of like TMF, and then they reported up through like clinical operations or QA. But now we're seeing actual career ladders and branches of more specialized roles, which is really exciting. But
Yep.
not every organization is going to have that luxury. They don't have the resourcing model to do that. So I do want to keep that in mind as well. There are a lot of very specific organizational challenges. So you may have to just look to see what organization aligns with your goals.
Yeah, and I think just to finish up, it just depends on what you want to do as well. I had a person that worked on my team as a document specialist at a sponsor, who now works for the FDA as an
Wow,
auditor. So
very
they
cool.
went from document specialist to QA and
Yeah.
moved up and went to the FDA.
It's like
So
they converted to the dark side, right? That's,
yeah,
that's what they want to
that's what I
say.
told her.
Yeah. And I do think we touched on this point earlier. There may be another question that comes in, but I made that joke, but I often say it's not us versus them. It's not sponsor versus CRO or TMF management versus functional areas. We truly all are working together. That is a very important note there. So I don't want people thinking my joke about the FDA being on the dark side. They're the enforcer, right? They're making sure we're meeting expectations, but they want us to succeed. So let me make sure
Yeah.
that's clear. It's documented. Don't want anybody coming after me. All right, let's see. Okay, so how can you start a career in TMF roles if someone's transitioning from another background? So I think for me, a lot of people still look at TMF roles as kind of that entry point. A lot of times, it's fascinating to me. I'm involved in a couple of social networking sites that kind of talk about, everybody's like, I want to be a CRA. Like, I have no background experience in clinical trials. I want to be a CRA, and almost everyone will say probably not going to happen outside of you maybe being like a medical doctor or like a research nurse or something. But within the TMF space, there's a little bit more leniency, right? Some organizations are starting to have more strict expectations for
Mhm.
experience or general background. There are opportunities that are available to kind of get some education prior to entering the space. So, as Laurel mentioned, she participated in the TMF University program. I actually facilitate and lead that. That'll give you a good understanding of some of the basic expectations of a TMF professional. It's 9 weeks of courses, or 9 courses total. You could take any of the 9. If there's an area of focus, document QC is one of those specific areas. As a previous hiring manager, I think for me, having those skills that we talked about that are necessary, like an attention to quality, like, can you you don't have to know clinical trial documentation, but can you, in your previous role, if you were an account manager or if you were a data entry clerk, did you notice when data was entered incorrectly? What did you do to reconcile that issue? Who did you communicate with? Those skills are very transferable, and you can start
Hmm.
to learn the documentation once you get into the industry. It's just having those kind of basic skills that I think are so important. So it's how you sell yourself in interviews. And I think the language of clinical research is also just so vast. It's a lot to really understand. So a lot of people, they get tripped up, perhaps if they don't feel confident talking through very clinical, like documentation, like a 1572 or an informed consent form. Don't focus as much on the types of documents, but it's addressing those quality issues and what you would do to communicate that information. I think that helps me kind of understand somebody's ability to meet the needs starting out, because I don't think you can come in as like with no experience and maybe be like a TMF study owner. That might be a tough transition.
Right.
There's a little bit more knowledge that's needed. But Laura, do you have different opinion, insights
No,
there?
I mean, I think you hit that spot on. I think there are opportunities. It just depends on the organization that you go to.
Mhm.
It's very rare that you get an entry level position, let's say at a vendor.
Sure.
But sponsors have entry level opportunities every day.
Yep.
They're looking for somebody that might have um, that experience, all of those skills we talked about. Maybe not on the clinical side, but they're just looking for somebody to do some of that grunt work, as we called it earlier.
Sure.
Um, and I still think that is sometimes the best way. You talked about that hands-on approach, right?
Mhm.
I Funny enough, I went to culinary school. Was where I went to school, and when I went to class, I learned more by getting into the kitchen, getting into the classrooms, and I learned more of what I needed for this role by getting my hands dirty, being in that room, really realizing what a document is. Because I will never forget my very first interview outside of that first job. Tell me all about the boxes in a 1572.
Yeah.
And if I hadn't have done that, if I hadn't have looked at all of those documents, I couldn't have answered that question.
Yep.
So I think really starting and diving into that is the way you're going to learn the most about documents. You
Yep.
can pick up everything else, regulations, all of that as you go through, but understanding the documents and the needs and the importance of them are key.
Sure. Yeah. And if anybody's curious, how could I get that experience outside of a work setting? So the TMF reference model does have,
Hmm.
or the TMF reference model group has the TMF reference model, which is kind of this industry guidance for documents that are expected to be filed. You can search for that online. You can download the current version, and then you can kind of search those document types on a search engine and then kind of
Yep.
get familiar with what they look like, the general expectations. So kind of doing a little bit of homework yourself. If you want to get into this space, you kind of need to understand the skills that are necessary, what we've talked about today, but also knowing a little bit of background is very helpful. A lot of organizations, as we have seen this shift to eTMF platforms, when I was interviewed, it wasn't really around like technology skills as much. It was around organization.
Hmm.
Now, companies want to know, have you worked in an eTMF platform? How can you translate that, right? An eTMF platform is an electronic system for storing documents. Have you worked in an electronic file before? Have you done data entry electronically before? Like metadata is a big buzzword. It's honestly data entry at the end of the day is what
Hmm.
metadata is. Have you done that in
Yep.
an electronic environment? Have you transposed from paper to electronic? Those are direct transferable skills, not in the system itself. So when they ask you about a particular platform, you may not know that system, but in the systems, we also issue like quality issues or queries. This wasn't done correctly. Have you worked in a system that allows you to communicate, hey, I have an issue electronically. There's an issue with this document. It needs to be resolved. That's almost directly transferable. So really kind of
Hmm.
understanding how technology is leveraged in the industry is very helpful. You can search. A lot of the technology platforms and vendors have demos that are available, or very helpful information on YouTube that you can kind of see the expectation. So doing a little bit of homework is very
Yep.
helpful. So yeah, I know we're closing on our last few minutes. Oh, a good one. Okay. As we work to develop a culture, and hey, Carol, a familiar name there, as we work to develop a culture where TMF is prioritized at the beginning of the study rather than when the inspector is coming tomorrow, what strategies have you seen used to convince functional area leads and leadership that TMF health is critical? Laura, you want to start this one?
Absolutely, and I'll try to be fast because I know we're
Sure.
we're coming up on time.
Right
But
at it.
this is my forte. We talk about culture and inspection readiness right from the start. So it's always important. We've done it numerous times where we set a workshop with the your TMF team
Mhm.
and your functional areas. We get them involved right from the start. We talk
Yep.
about the importance. We talk about the risks if they don't participate. We give them timelines. We talk about um, flexibility. We do include that as well, as if you need help you ask that team. But at the end of the day, everyone's responsible for the TMF, and at
Yep.
the end of the day, when that inspector comes, we do that. We always introduce Alcoa principles. We talk about contemporaneous TMFs. And we what we do is we try to make those workshops interactive, where we're asking the team, what do you
Mhm.
know? We're asking that functional
Yep.
area, what are the documents that you think you're responsible for that go into the TMF?
Yeah.
So we
Love that.
engage them and pull those questions. Um, and it's so funny because they look at us with this blank stare.
Yeah.
Um, and it's like, okay, you've got this. You know what documents, just answer it, right? So
Yeah.
we make it interactive. And I think if you just dictate, you say this, 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 and this, they're not going to listen, right? And we
Sure.
said that earlier. But by setting that stage where it's interactive, they can ask the TMF champion or TMF lead those questions and
Yep.
know what their roles are. And again, making sure that you have the management and leadership above you to be successful.
Absolutely. And I do think one thing, we want to set that expectation. Process has to be there. So if you want people to perform actions, it needs to be recognized somewhere in your process and
Yes.
there has to be that standard. Otherwise, you have no level of accountability. I always say you have no leverage in your conversation to hold that person accountable because they'll say, it
Hmm.
doesn't say I have to do it. Why are you asking me to do it? I do love that engagement, kind of like a kickoff meeting for the trial master file. You made a great comment there. What documents are expected for the trial master file? And people give you a blank stare. Start to remove the TMF from your conversation. I found to be an effective
Hmm.
way to engage with people. It's not what's expected for the TMF. What documents are you generating for this study for your role? Right? They should know that, right? That's their job to know what documents they need to be producing. Then you can start to say, okay, let's work together to see what needs to be in the trial master file. But it does start from the very beginning.
Yes.
You have to have those conversations, those meetings. So you need to create a resourcing model. That allows you to have the time to have a kickoff meeting. We're not talking hours, right? 30 minutes to maybe an
Yep.
hour to have these conversations at the very beginning to set the tone. And then also, you're now creating that opportunity for engagement and continued conversation. So you're showing support from the very beginning. And then to kind of tie it up here, it's again that collaboration. It's not I'm telling you all this, as was previously mentioned. It's here's what's expected. Here's how I'm going to support you. Here's how I need you to support the process. Let's meet in the middle and get it done
Yeah.
together. So I know
Absolutely.
easier said than done. I always say it's always easier said than done. It is tough. It takes time. Transition always takes time. But implementing these strategies, you start to see people get more comfortable in the TMF space. It is going to take time. It's no overnight solution when it comes to the TMF.
Very true.
Yeah. So I know, wow, I cannot believe it's already been an hour. I could talk about it probably for 3 more. But just want to say thank you to everybody for who was able to join. We're excited to continue to have these engaging opportunities. If you do have questions, you can see a link there that's available. So excited to be here again with everybody. Thanks for taking some time. Hopefully you feel excited and engaged about what it is to be a TMF professional or excited for career opportunities. And again, thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your week.
Thanks, everybody.